I always love people who ask me, why should I read books other than the Bible? To which my usual response is, why are you talking to me when you could be praying? Reading of old books is a kind of licit necromancy, a phrase that I probably shouldn't use. It's a way of talking to those that we can't otherwise talk to without doing terrible things. I became Orthodox because I became convinced it was true, and I could find Jesus there. The body that went into the tomb, came out of the tomb, transformed. All those things are true. They're true. They're true in the sense that I, as a philosopher, would want to talk about truth. It's okay to be proud of your heritage as long as you don't tell lies about it, and as long as your love doesn't become disproportionate. The existence of aliens is a really good example of how comfortable Orthodoxy can be with weirdness. Orthodoxy is a church for true romantics who don't want to let romanticism consume them.
Another episode of Re-Enchanting. I'm Belle Tindall.
And I'm Justin Brierley.
And we are here once again to talk about re-enchanting, our favourite topic. Wondering whether we are seeking it, whether we're craving it, whether we're in a disenchanted world, and whether we're seeking something different.
And there's been some really interesting activity lately in the Eastern Orthodox wing of the church that we thought was quite relevant to the topic that we like to discuss here on Re-Enchanting. So joining us today is Dr. John Mark Reynolds. He's president of St. Constantine Schools and College and the author of numerous books, including When Athens Met Jerusalem, An Introduction to Classical and Christian Thought. He's also the editor of the Great Books Reader. Frequent blogger, lecturer on a wide range of topics, including ancient philosophy, classical and home education, politics, faith and virtue. Now, John Mark was involved in some recent research that made global headlines, showing a huge upswing in the numbers of young men entering the Eastern Orthodox Church, precisely the demographic that is most absent in most churches. So what is it about this ancient church stream that has re-enchanted these young converts? That's what we're going to be talking to John Mark about today.
Boy, am I curious about this topic. John Mark, hello. It's lovely to be with you.
It's wonderful to be here.
Before we dig into everything that Justin has just said, we usually record on top of Lambeth Palace Library. And so our first question is always somewhat of an ode to our re-enchanting home. And we want to know what you're currently reading.
So for my job and for pleasure, this is going to sound horrible, but I read the Republic every semester. So I'm working my way again through Plato's Republic. But I'm also reading, and I just wanted to point out, Alexander Schmemann is Too Little Red, and they collected his radio broadcasts that really were done by Voice of America when communism was a thing in the Soviet Union. And watching the development of his ideas, I read volume 1, I'm now on volume 2, is really good and interesting. I'm reading a bio of the Emperor Justinian. That's the other thing in front of me. And then for my sins, I'm reading William Shatner's Boldly Go. So lest I be just utterly pretentious beyond belief.
Well, do you know what? I am ashamed to say that William Shatner's Boldly Go is the only one of those I've read. Which really has humbled me somewhat.
I got to shake William Shatner's hand for half a second, one of those long lines last year, because I believed I needed to do that. The best thing that Canada has ever sent the United States, William Shatner. He's just...
As a scholar of the classical world, do you find that a lot of your reading is basically you're going back a couple of thousand years in the people you're imbibing on a regular basis?
Yeah, I think that's true. Generally, I got into this line of work, in my 20s because I love the ancient world. I love thinking about the ancient world. But I'm also I was one of those crazy kids who became monomaniacal about some topic like circus fires, and then had to know everything there was to know about circus fires, or the death of the last Russian Tsar, less amusingly. And so I was also a big science fiction, fantasy reader. And so I'm the kind of person that for fun will read Brandon Sanderson, who no one will confuse as being a great author. But he churns out 700-page books the way most of us breathe. And so I find that that's fun and that's good. I once taught a class on vampire literature just for fun. I don't even know that it was for credit. And students came and did that. That was kind of the apex of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer period of American life. So started with Penny Dreadful's Barney the Vampire and worked our way up to Buffy and more modern renditions. So I find that people who like doing what I like doing for a living pretty much need to read omnivorously, like read everything. And it's fun. So when parents sometimes ask me what their kids should read, get them to read, which nowadays is a difficult thing to do. And then I found, for example, growing up reading the Narnia books or Tolkien, I remember the day I was sitting on the school bus and I started Lord of the Rings, having read Hobbit as a younger person. And I realized in 7th grade that my entire weekend was gone. Like that was going to be the end of my weekend. And in 7th grade, you could do that, right? You could just spend the entire weekend, go to church, but spend the entire weekend reading Lord of the Rings, which I did and kept reading. I hate to admit I skipped all the poetry when I was in 7th grade because why did Tolkien put like really long, boring poems in the middle of this action adventure book? And so as an adult, of course, I also found audiobooks are interesting this way. This is the other tip I often give. It's very good to listen to audiobooks in books that you've read many, many times. So I find that I edit books, for example, the Narnia books, that I'd speed read every time through the parts of it I didn't like. And an audiobook will force me to listen to all of it. And actually you discover, oh, I get it. I read this book when I was in 7th grade the first time. And these are awesome, and I should have paid more attention. And I've been, spending decades editing out the parts of the book I don't like.
I love that. I've got our youngest is currently right in the middle of the Percy Jackson series.
Yeah, there you go.
And so that's obviously introducing him in that kind of way to Greek mythology and literature and the stories and so on. So he's having a great time, always regaling me on the Greek god of this and the Greek god of that. But I feel like it's, he's probably a little bit, he's not quite ready for, the full on Greek classical stuff yet, but it may be a way in, and that's important, isn't it?
It is. When you get to the Iliad, and we should all get to the Iliad, and you're thinking of that first line, sing goddess of the wrath of Achilles, Peleus' son, these won't be unfamiliar names. So for a lot of us, when we first read the Iliad, just the names, like who's the A guy? And then, oh no, in the first page, there are 2 A guys. So how do I keep track of them all? But somebody who grew up on Percy Jackson will find a lot of the names really familiar and not have to do maybe I'm the only one that does that with books like that. But if they're unfamiliar names, we tend to, it's just a struggle to keep track of characters.
Yeah.
And so
I found the same with Narnia. It kind of, it softened the ground for, as you say, Lord of the Rings, which is the more meaty kind of stuff. And then that might take you back to the other authors of ancient times.
I have to say, going from the Dionysus or Bacchus figure in, I think it's Prince Caspian, and then having to read like Greek portrayals of him in like the Bacchae is a little eye-opening. And you realize how C.S. Lewis caused Bacchus to become saved or something. He found faith in Christ and became a much better God.
Well, this kind of leads us neatly and actually into something that is quite central to what you do as president of the St. Constantine Schools and College, because I believe that's very much focused on what's sometimes called classical education.
Right.
So I guess having that kind of wide range of reading is, why is that such an important value for you in terms of the schooling and the curriculum that you encourage?
Well, I think, and this started really with St. Basil in the East, this kind of tension that St. Basil presents in his orations to young men heading off to a place like Plato's Academy. Plato wasn't there, but the Academy historically, where you're going to be reading Homer. and you're going to be finding wisdom from Homer. And the fact that the church always thought you could do that it was very exceptional, and usually that person ended up in heresy who thought that you couldn't do that. And so this kind of tension between, here's a person that we don't think gets everything right, and in fact in the Iliad gets a good bit wrong, seriously wrong. But somehow this stream of wisdom, we can receive it in ways that are prefatory and illuminating to the deeper wisdom that one finds in sacred scripture. So, for example, when I wrestle with the Iliad and I ask myself the question, in the first line of the Iliad, there's a tension where really the gods come between the hero and his own passion. And what does it mean when I become separated from my own feelings? I can kind of interact with Homer in ways that I'm afraid, as a believer, I sometimes am too hesitant to do dialectically with Scripture. And it helps me do that. Scripture, of course, demands from us our hardest questions, demands from us our hardest dialectical interaction. But sometimes it's like interacting. My mom taught me to argue in a good way. She just enjoyed examining everything. But there is a sort of appropriate piety when you argue with your mother where, how much do you want to win an argument? I, in fact, never could win an argument with my mother, so I didn't have to worry about it. But there is an appropriate piety, even with religious texts, that I think St. Basil would say to us, okay, learn to wrestle, learn to get wisdom from these sources that are as flawed as you are. In fact, less flawed than you are. I always love people who ask me, why should I read books other than the Bible or other than sacred texts like the Church Fathers? To which my usual response is, why are you talking to me when you could be praying? I mean, it's obviously better to talk to God than it is to talk to me. Have mercy on me, a sinner. But humans crave human interaction, and Homer was a human, and the reading of old books is a kind of licit necromancy, a phrase that I probably shouldn't use. It's a way of talking to those that we can't otherwise talk to without doing terrible things, like calling up the dead. And so we have a kind of chronological loneliness I don't think humans realize. We're talking about re-enchantment, but part of that is, in the world as I understand it was meant to be, I should be able to go see Father Adam eventually, given the billions of people who would want to be talking to him, and interact with him, or Mother Eve. But I'm cut off from that generation. I'm cut off from the 18th century. I think, the last Victorian died sometime during my lifetime. And at that moment, I became cut off from a certain kind of experience in literature that I really wish that I could experience. I tell some of my college students, go talk to a World War II veteran now. There are almost none of them left. And when you're my age, and it's 150 years since World War II, you'll be one of the last repositories, living repositories that can report on the experience of having lived through the Second World War. That's a loneliness. That's a loneliness. My great-grandfather fought on the Union side of the American Civil War. I was recently in Richmond giving a talk at a conference and had to report that the last time John Reynolds was in Richmond, he was a prisoner of war in Virginia during the Civil War. But I can't talk to him. I'm cut off from his experience of being in the prison in Richmond. And that's a part of this disenchantment. And books help with that. Books are the only appropriative palliative cure, which is why I think God left us holy books.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much that you just said that I've never thought about. Chronological loneliness. I think I'm going to be thinking about that phrase for a long time. We had a chat with historian Sarah Irvine Stonebreaker, where she talks about having almost this priestly role when it comes to history and how we live in an ahistorical age and how we are so much poorer for it. And so she just had this lovely story, this lovely anecdote she shared with us, where when she had her daughter, she had all of her family and her husband's family come and say stories over her daughter as a way of saying, this is who you are. These are the stories that have brought you to this place. So I guess, is it also, to varying degrees, is it also about a sort of a belonging and an identity? And these are the stories, these are the people, this is the wrestling, these are the atrocities, these are the flaws.
Yes.
If we disconnect ourselves from them, we're living in an ahistorical age, and that sort of means we're in a way disconnected from the circumstances that make us who we are.
And we tend to rewrite history so that if one watches like a historical movie, it's very frustrating to me to watch. I know younger adults no longer watch Cameron's Titanic. It's of a particular period as much. Yeah,
I watched it on Sunday. No, don't apologize.
So there you go. But as a person who really
there.
cares about the Titanic, which, by the way, had lots of Eastern Orthodox passengers on it, coming from Lebanon and Antioch, who never make the cut in movies. Somehow they never make the cut as passengers in the movie. But look, it's terribly romantic. And as a terribly romantic person, I love it. But notice that the sensibilities in the film are very much people talk and act, however perfect the costuming is, as if they're in the 1990s, early 2000s. They carry that kind of moral framework. And I'm old enough to have had a great aunt who was fabulously old when I knew her, who grew up eating bread paid for by my great-great-grandfather's Civil War pension, Grand Army of the Republic pension. And talking to her often illustrated to me attitudes that were impossible to recover. And then even historians, when I talk to them, can't recover. When I was a little boy, very old men would get up in Appalachia in West Virginia, where I'm from, and sing songs moved by the Spirit that no one knew anymore. And the kind of drone, Scots-Irish drone sound is impossible to recover. And I heard it, no one recorded it, and those songs are lost forever. Because we can't recapture it. I was once talking to my great aunt, for example, and she was still upset about hippies in the 1960s, in the 80s. She was still upset by them. But the thing that she could never understand, I don't want to get too explicit for a family show, was people burning certain underwear. And I think my mom's generation would have the reaction of how inappropriate that was. Her reaction was why people wore French nasty women's undergarments, because she grew up in the late 19th, early 20th century, where shifts and other things existed. And this whole notion that we spent a lot of money, male and female, on undergarments, she couldn't get her head around it. So that's what she was offended by. So even trying to figure out what would have offended my great aunt, I think even a historian, we lose track of the bizarre sensibilities. I shouldn't call them bizarre. I mean, maybe they're better than ours, because once that person is dead, the kind of framework they grew up in is dead too. And no matter how hard we try, no matter how hard I try, I turn Plato into a 21st century human at my great risk and peril, because then I'm not interacting with anything other than my own head. It's like going to sacred scripture and somehow sacred scripture turns out to be the Republican or Democratic Party at prayer here in the United States. Either direction so flattens scripture that I no longer can be challenged by it in any way, shape, or form. I'm sorry, you got me on a rant there.
Well, no, it's good, but it leads me into the next question, which is that perhaps part of the attraction then of Eastern Orthodoxy for you? Because in a sense, it is obviously embedded in so many ways in a tradition that goes back essentially unchanged for a long time, and perhaps is harder to sort of create a sort of 20th century kind of version of it, in a sense, when you're essentially doing and saying the same things that people did 1,000 years ago.
Begun life kind of poorly and drifting away. Plato was very helpful in bringing me back to faith. Plato existed in a kind of suburb where I could come back to faith. And so I came to the conclusion over time, I had wonderful parents. I had a wonderful church experience. I didn't leave anything because it was terrible or awful. Eventually, my dad and mom also became Orthodox, but it was actually painful as the first person in my family to become Orthodox, to have any sense of separation, because they were so awesome and I wasn't. So you know how everybody blames their parents for their problems? I could never do that. I blame them for being unable to blame them for my problems. But as a person in need of mercy, I think that Christians need to realize you minimally need a church that can both handle the questions of a Nobel laureate, the questions of a first century Palestinian, and of course, Orthodoxy is a church where the liturgy is still said in Aramaic. Jesus could understand the liturgy in one small valley. Hopefully that valley will survive the turmoil of this present age. And it needs to be able to handle the questions of, the yaya, the grandmother, or the grandfather, who may be simple in one sense in their faith. And being able to do all of those things at once really narrows down the possibilities. And I was neither interested in going to the Church of Head Knowledge, where, a PhD in philosophy, we would sit around and discuss the problem of evil, which is, my background is analytic philosophy. Nor did I want to go to a church where I had to shut my brain off at the door. And of course, kind of person that would listen to this would be like that. I wanted to be able to learn from my Nana, because no Reynolds up to my dad's generation had access in 400 years. We came from actually Whitechapel over to a place called Jamestown in the 17th century. We were the stupid people who didn't buy slaves and plant tobacco and kept moving west, becoming ever more poor and obscure and unimportant. But I wanted to be able to be in communion and be in a place that could also, that simple faith, in one way intellectually, that was so rich in my grandparents that I could never, if I'm ever as holy as they were, that would be something. It needed to be a church that included all those things. And I won't make you a list of possibilities there, but Orthodoxy was certainly one of them. And then you have to ask yourself the question, best you can, who's right about certain important issues? Where is the fullness of the faith to be found? And I came to the conclusion that it was in Orthodoxy. But one thing I liked is that Orthodoxy doesn't proselytize. It makes converts simply by being. Here we are. In fact, sometimes this is to a fault. When I first visited a Greek parish, they said, well, you're an English-speaking person. You've been in the U.S. for a while. Why don't you go down to the street to the English-speaking church? Sometimes Orthodox people will come to the U.S. and attend. This is actually knew a medical doctor who did this. She attended a Presbyterian church for decades, finally came to my dad, who was a pastor in another denomination, and said, somebody needs to call the bishop. My pastor just denied the virgin birth. And Dad had to explain that, in fact, all churches in the United States weren't roughly Orthodox. And so, I had to explain the whole thing to her, and it made her sad. And so Orthodoxy was, for me, the best option because it could capture the wholeness of church history. It was talking to the first century and it was talking to the 21st century. And it struck me as true. It could handle science. It could handle literature. It wasn't denying any part of human reality.
Can you... I actually think that Orthodoxy might be the most represented stream of Christianity in our podcast, perhaps. We've had Martin Shaw, Paul Kingsnorth, Jonathan Pajot, all of whom we're adult converts to Orthodoxy. And I was just looking back over their episodes and seeing what they said drew them. And so for Martin Shaw, it was that he didn't want a tradition that was going to be too easy on him. Yes. For him, he wanted to be stretched. For Jonathan Pajot, it was various things, but he pulled out the beauty. And for Paul Kingsnorth, he said something really interesting. He said that it's the strength of Orthodoxy. And he said that two things have happened. It's faced a lot of persecution, and it's always been in sort of a position of not having a huge amount of power, not being hugely represented, etc., etc. And then he said, and I'm going to quote him, is that it hasn't been hacked about by humanism or modernity. So he sort of says, it hasn't had to bend with the Reformation, the Enlightenment, or the Renaissance. And so do any of those in particular, ring a bell with you, or is it just all of those things? I was just really interested by those different answers.
I think there's truth to that. So there are pockets of Orthodoxy that haven't interacted, but Russian Orthodoxy, for example, has whole streams that did interact and try to deal with the Renaissance because, of course, the birth of science, which came more from the Western parts of the world out of medieval Catholicism, nobody rejects. And so coming to terms with that in the parts of Orthodoxy that because of the kind of exile of Orthodox thought that came with Ottoman conquest, and even the Russian experience of being conquered by the Mongols did delay this kind of development. And the strength of that is that it meant that Orthodox thinkers could develop different approaches to how to deal with modernity, with how to deal with the birth of science. So what is science is a question that maybe Orthodox thinkers, particularly in Russia, came to later in time as science developed, as the scientific revolution developed, and came up with alternative answers, with other answers. But I actually would like to stress the commonality. All Christianity, the Orthodox Church, is born out of the experience of Jesus of Nazareth, who lived in Palestine and who spread the word in that eastern land. And then the church grew in places like what we would call Turkey today, Asia Minor, the great churches of the book of Revelation, into Greece, and then spread west, of course, famously Paul to Rome. And the commonality of all of that, Orthodoxy never stopped that great conversation, even when it was being conquered. But I will say this, as a person of my age, belonging to the church that in the 20th century produced probably the most martyrs in Christian history was also appealing to me.
I was going to say, for the benefit of those who perhaps have not experienced an Eastern Orthodox worship service, maybe have just a few ideas in their head about, the somewhat ornate robes or sort of, types of churches that are often examples of that. Could you give us sort of a layperson's guide to what a typical service might be that you might attend?
I will only introduce the caveat that I'm a philosopher, not a theologian, and I don't even play a theologian on television. So I'm not, if my priest calls me and yells at me, I'm not going to give you a theological description, but a layperson's experience. Go ahead. I think, and maybe this is because I'm a Platonist, the Eastern Orthodox Church the liturgy has stayed in contact with both the head, the human heart, and the sensual experience, the physical experience of worship. So probably the first thing that I would have noticed as I first came to a typical Orthodox church were the smells, the sounds, the ornateness, the gilding, the way the light comes. Generally, the Orthodox churches don't use stained glass. My own home parish uses a kind of see-through stone. Or clear glass, and the way the light interacts with all the gilding that's there is very intentional. It isn't to be fancy. It's there to draw every part of my sensibility into worship because I'm a physical being. You stand up a lot in an Orthodox service. Most traditional Orthodox churches didn't have pews or places for anyone other than older people to sit. And the older people never sit. They're the ones that never sit because they've been standing up for decades. That kind of even exhaustion. Also, then secondarily, for the heart, the Orthodox liturgy doesn't generally change. And where it does change with the passage of time, anyone watching this podcast knows the church calendar. So in a very similar way, very similar church calendar, we journey through the life of Christ. We journey through the life of saints, many of whom are illuminated around us as a kind of window to heaven. As we reflect on and ask, as that great cloud of witnesses, we ask them to cheer us on from paradise. This also engages our hearts. It's the very unchangingness that when you first go to an Orthodox church, it's very interesting. And so sometimes people want to rush to convert because it's cool to go. And the first Lent that you go through is kind of cool. Well, I'm suffering for Jesus and I'm giving up all these foods. But the nice thing, when I became Orthodox, did a good degree, worked hard, written a little bit, no one in Orthodoxy cares that I exist. Because they're the church of centuries, of millennia. And, if I'm not going to say anything that anyone cares about. And so that's a good thing, right? The church endures. The church contains a great cloud of witnesses. And so my intellect can engage with those people. And the liturgy itself will hold up to intellectual engagement and thought. And so all of this goes together. What I was going to say is eventually when the newness of the liturgy wears down, the hard work, the labor, which is what liturgy means really, the labor of the liturgy, the fact that man, I wish we had different Lenten disciplines, and some of them are drawn from like the 1st and 2nd century. We're eating poor people food, and poor people food has changed. Why can't we have Cheetos? Because in West Virginia, that was what we ate. It's poor Mountain Dew and Cheetos. It's poor people food. Why don't we fast with it? But of course, the church could care less about my opinion. And by the church, I mean the church living and dead, universal. A living bishop could no longer get up in the morning and say, except for a dispensation for me for medical reasons or something, oh, yes, we're going to change the fasting rules of the church because John Mark wrote a clever article in, some philosophical journal. It's just not going to happen. No, there's no one equipped to do it.
Yeah. And what's interesting to me then, coming to sort of, one of the core reasons we asked you on here, is that given that the church has never been trying to kind of capture the culture, it's been very happy to just do what it's always done.
Right.
It hasn't really indulged in celebrities. It hasn't really, changed much. It's not been evangelistic, as you say,
right.
In that sense. There's been this extraordinary rise in the number of young people, especially young men, wanting to adopt Eastern Orthodoxy. So I know that an institute that you're part of has, done some of the key research on this that was later featured in some global news articles and so on. Just tell us about this research you did, what you found out, and then we'll talk about some of the reasons why perhaps we're seeing this.
Right. St. Constantine College, I've been a college professor my whole career, and then decided it would be good to establish like micro colleges where people could experience dialectical, what in an English context might be described as Oxbridge style education, one-on-one tutorials that were affordable. And in the American context, that's exceedingly rare. And so that's kind of the mission of the college. And then simultaneously, the college began to want to study things. You get a group of academics together and they want to do research. And so one thing we wanted to research right away was the longevity of conversions. That's what started the process. As waves of converts came, do they stick? You don't just decide one day to become Orthodox and immediately sign a card and you're Orthodox. Usually it takes a couple of years before your priest will suggest, okay, you should become an Orthodox Christian. Since we don't believe, Anglicans are going to hell, and, there's not a rush in the door. We want to make sure people understand. We think we're the church. That's not to be like overly ecumenical, but we don't rush people in. And what we discovered was there's a real stickiness that despite what some people might think, converts stay. And they endure. They stay involved in church. In fact, converts may stay more involved in church than some cradle Orthodox do. The stickiness is greater. In that, we discovered, and we're still in the early days of this, the research is limited, but it's good quality. We've had statisticians look at it, and we'll keep growing the research, is that we discovered married couples with children convert at a very high rate. But the highest rate of conversions and single women convert at a lower rate than married couples, but they do convert. But single men are the highest group of converts, equaling married couples or surpassing them in some cases. And we began to think about how to try to explain that. I have actually a different explanation than most people give, and it is that in the American context, in general, and I'm not fit to tell you why this is true, men are not doing well. They don't go to college in as high a rate as women do, and good for women. You don't want to suppress the number of women that are going to college. They're not going to grad school at the same rates as women, and they exhibit antisocial behaviors in a much higher rate than women do. And if you think about people who convert, if your life and worldview is working for you, you're not necessarily looking around. You're looking to fix the things that aren't working for you. But if in general, you go to college, you're doing pretty well, you've got a decent job, then you're not looking for, what's wrong, what's broken in me. And so I think the male population, single male population, it's no big insight to say that in the U.S. context, at least, it's not doing very well. And so if you're in a group that's not doing very well, looking around and saying, what's wrong with me? What is truth? Is there a way out of this pit? And often this leads to very bad answers. So, for example, I've had to interact with I don't want to say students because I don't want to identify anyone. So I've had to interact with young men who are attracted to Nazism and fascism. And over the whole course of my career, I've had many students attracted to Bolshevism or extreme views of Marxism. But for the first time, I began to run into college-age people who were attracted by really bad forms of fascism, not the misuse of the term, but they, wanted Mein Kampf for Christmas as a Christmas present, an English version. They were, but it was because it's a very evil thing, but they were looking for something different. And since the establishment didn't seem to like them, and since the establishment rightly, I will underline, hates Nazis, they began to look at, well, am I hated like the Nazis? And is there some truth there? So I think Orthodoxy eventually, for those who kept thinking and pursuing the truth, engaging in the truth, you come to Jesus because Jesus is the center of the Christian faith. And having come to Jesus, where can I experience Jesus in a timeless way that will minister to the whole person? We talked about how the liturgy engages head, heart, and hands, the body. And I think eventually young men explore that inside of Orthodoxy. The other advantage we have in the U.S. is people are very familiar with other forms of Christianity, and they carry the burden of that familiarity. We have our own mistakes. You only have to look at Russia and the Ukraine to avoid any sense of Orthodox triumphalism. But in the U.S. context, people can kind of, I'll quote the vice president, the previous vice president, unburdened by what has been, and they can see what might be. So I think there's some of that as well. Most people in the U.S. still haven't heard of Orthodoxy, and I get asked all the time if I'm Jewish, for example. There are college programs that will study the Middle East, and not making this up, and they'll have a lot of Jewish scholars. Great, that's good, they should. They'll have a lot of Islamic scholars. Great, that's good, they should. But there are no Christians involved. There are no Christians engaged in a church that has endured in the Middle East since the time of Jesus, because we just don't appear on anyone's radar. And there's an advantage to that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Particularly what you said about the fact that it's like your rituals, your practices, your tradition is timeless. And so I guess the attraction then is if a demographic of people are feeling hated by their culture, well, here's a place that looks nothing like my culture. What rest, what freedom, what sort of, what newness. I love your explanation there, because I read the articles. So there's an article by the New York Post, I believe, and then that was also picked up by...
And of course, the New York Post would never be sensationalist, so it's always very...
Well, this was my issue, because I read that and I didn't love it, because it was saying...
No, I didn't love it either.
No, because it was saying, it was basically saying that all of these men were looking for a traditional and a masculine form of Christianity. And I got the traditional part. And now that you've explained it, I get that even more, like something that's timeless, something that's ageless, something that feels like it connects you, something that breaks down that chronological loneliness that you were talking about. And it feels authentic and sturdy and unshakable. But then I was like, but what does masculine mean in that context?
Yeah, I don't like that at all as a framing, because I think if you come to the church, it's the wholeness of the human person. It is, what is it to be a man? What is it to be a woman? Can I find answers to that? And if anybody's converting to Orthodoxy out of some kind of bro culture, Orthodoxy itself will rapidly, I have a prayer rope on my wrist, and the prayer that I pray most constantly, and the Orthodox pray most constantly, is, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. So you're unlikely to become, get an exalted view of yourself or put down other people, because Christianity is essentially the greatest virtue is love. The greatest virtue is charity. And so I'll point out what people skip over. Maybe the biggest group of people to convert to Orthodoxy are younger married people with children. If you look at our own study, and younger married intact traditional families, of course, mean there's a man and a woman involved in the family. I think it's an interesting question why not as many single women convert to Orthodoxy? And that's the more interesting question to me than that every other category of people in the U.S. are tempted to convert to Orthodoxy. And I think, again, the temptation is to fit whatever, preconceptions you have about the way the church should look and give easy answers to those questions. So I don't really have an answer to that question other than to suggest that conversion itself is difficult. People don't rush to convert to something they don't know. And so you have to be looking for something different. You have to be looking for something new. And so I would wonder if it doesn't correlate with social satisfaction or dissatisfaction more than anything else.
I get the sense, too, from some of the young converts I've spoken to who've gone in the direction either of a sort of quite traditional Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy, that it is the kind of, as you said earlier, Belle, the kind of strength, but not in the sense of a kind of masculine domineering, but of kind of the rigor that it requires, that is what's attractive. It's difficult. It's not a kind of just, hey, just come along and we'll just give you a sort of a slight sheen on your life and some tips on how to live your best life. It's kind of, it's entering something that's quite different, that demands something of you, that can be quite difficult to understand, actually, not necessarily easy. But there's something that, in an odd way, that often goes against all of our kind of seeker-friendly evangelistic advice that we've imbibed of very often in the Western Church, is actually more attractive, interestingly. And especially, I think, yes, to some of these young men who perhaps feel like, as Belle was saying, it's different to what's on offer already in the culture.
We're not selling anything. I guess what I would,
go ahead.
If you go to a regular parish, I think the other problem is it would be like having read X or Twitter, which I'm no longer on right now, but having read it during the election and decided how the election was going to go based on the people represented on Twitter or X. Or your favorite social media platform, or by people, for example, who listen to talk radio. Back in the day when talk radio was big and I did guest hosting and things like that, they would always tell me, if your friends like this show, it will fail. Because it's a mass market movement. And so when you're talking about tens of millions of people, I think sometimes we're too tempted, because it's so easy to quantify, to go on social media and look at those converts and turn them into the norm. As opposed to the young married couple who was looking for a church that wasn't selling them something, that wasn't a product, that just wanted to express the faith once delivered to the apostles. And I want to say something about timelessness. The liturgy itself has slowly evolved over time. If you dropped into first century Palestine, no one was doing the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, right? Exactly as it's done. It grew out of temple worship. It grew out of the synagogues. Prayers were added over centuries. The point is, and Belle, you captured this really well, is that the liturgy is timeless in the sense that the entirety of church history, right back to the first century, and some of the most ancient prayers in the liturgy can be found, and it isn't changing with the minute. It's changing with the century. And so, I had a mentor who said, there's some big social issues that are going on right now, and the mind of the church needs to reflect on them, and we'll let you know in 300 years what we think. And so as a dialectically based analytic philosopher, I want to think about it and write a paper and tell you not what you should think, but enter into dialogue with you. But the church, universal, isn't sitting in dialogue with me. It's saying, okay, here's what we've received. This is what's true. It has to be applied to your life. It has to be applied to the 21st century. We're a church of the vernacular. Wherever we've gone, we've translated the liturgy into the vernacular of the people. So we're a church that changes in a sense, but it isn't in a marketing sense. Like, oh no, we're not going to be relevant to the year 2025.
And I got this from listening to an interview with Father Andrew Damick, who you may be familiar with, John Mark, who's one of the sort of
works with us in USI.
Yeah, so he's a priest in the Orthodox Church, and he was just saying, being asked about this, upsurge in young men entering parishes, he said, well, we were as confused as everyone else. We hadn't changed anything. We weren't doing anything differently. Suddenly, all these young men were just showing up. There was no kind of, people were asking, have you, has there been some big evangelistic, campaign? And he said, no, that just wouldn't work in Orthodox circles. Yet, at the same time, something is obviously driving these young men to go to all the bother, or these young couples or whoever to find their local Orthodox church. I wonder how much you think the influence of some of those names we mentioned earlier, like Paul Kingsnorth, Martin Shaw, Jonathan Pajot, especially, alongside his friend Jordan Peterson, who are obviously reaching a lot of these young men. And do you think that's having an influence on these young people?
It obviously is. I mean, if anybody's talking to millions of people and Orthodoxy becomes an option, that for Orthodoxy, particularly in the North American context, is a big deal. If you say you're Orthodox in the United States, most people still have no clue what you're talking about. And sometimes I'll just say, the churches you're always praying for because someone's killing people, Christians, that's us. We're almost always the group that you're praying for because someone is killing us. And so that sometimes helps people. But like I said, we're almost invisible. And so for someone who's very prominent, that has a platform to millions of a certain kind of person, to even put us on the radar is immediately going to lead to a curiosity that a local parish isn't used to. They're plugging along, being faithful. But the other thing is, so this is where I'm going to be naughty in a way. I became Orthodox because I became convinced it was true and I could find Jesus there. And so people come and they're curious and they're engaging in the Nicene Creed and they're wrestling with it. And it's said every week and they're trying to understand it. But then it isn't just intellectual. They're told, go fast, go get your body in shape. Great Lent is coming up. And I know there are people that look forward to it, but I'm a Reynolds, and that means we like to eat, as I demonstrate. And so that's a hard discipline for me because the foods I like best are the foods you get rid of during Lent. But it's good for me. It's good for my soul. And so it's that kind of thing that people come to say, and I'm not making any claims about any other traditions, this is where I can find the fullness of faith. We know where the church is. We're not making a statement about where the church is not.
That reminds me of something, Justin, you say quite frequently actually, but about Christianity as a whole, is there has to be an element to which it's only useful and it's only attractive because it's true.
Yeah.
So I like that that's the base answer. Yeah, because I think it's true.
We're also a church of miracles. I mean, we're a church of weeping icons and hagiographies that if you look at, one way of looking at history would be the intercession of the saints and how they've held us back from nuclear annihilation. Now, I don't advocate historians in a secular context always work that way, but the possibility of the miraculous, Orthodoxy doesn't deny it, but it also doesn't become crazy about it. So that, any local person who decides some woo-woo thing has occurred, we all rush over and take a look at it. Again, we'll say, well, in 100 years, we'll really know what Father so-and-so and his weeping icon were up to. And then we might canonize the person. That will be cool. And so as a church that, every church does celebrity and gets bitten by it. It's not that we don't do it. But there's no money in it inside of Orthodoxy. And so we don't usually get as many grifters.
I was going to say, though, that aspect of Orthodoxy, which is obviously that kind of openness to the supernatural and to miraculous, the weird, as one of our guests on our first season put it, Tom Holland, he again is a good example of someone who, while he hasn't gone to Eastern Orthodoxy, has very much been drawn to the very Anglo-Catholic tradition. In a conversation I shared with him about a year ago, he talked about the fact that the thing that brought him closest actually to conversion was actually a prayer uttered actually to the Virgin Mary and that this led to, a series of events happened that led to him being cleared of a cancer diagnosis. Now, he says that it's the weirdness, actually, that he thinks is actually quite attractive to people now. People aren't looking for a sort of very rationalized, humanistic version of Christianity. And I think that's sometimes the mistake, again, that our seeker-sensitive movement makes, is that we have to kind of play down all of the strangeness and the weirdness. But actually, from his point of view, people are actually looking for that now. I don't know if that's your experience.
No, it is. And I'll repeat, I think you would find the church where miracles can occur and are recognized to have occurred and be occurring, and where, again, the most rigorous scientific imagination can also live and flourish and grow. So that pre-revolutionary Russia was no paradise, but also our image of it is sometimes we get it through Soviet propaganda. But if you take a look, they were producing first-rate chemists, Nobel quality chemists, and also producing miracles inside of a whole culture. Now, it's deeply defective, or the Russian Revolution wouldn't have occurred. But there is something there where we can say, is it possible to be in a church where this is in a Western context, but it's a saint recognized by both churches. I'm being a tourist, walking through Milan, doing my thing, and I look over to my left, and there is St. Ambrose laying there in vestments. Older than Augustine, obviously. St. Ambrose, pray for me. And I have to say, as a normal human being, my first reaction was not holiness. It was, there's a dead guy over in a glass case. What in the world? But then, as a person who loves history and the hymnody of the church, for example, which Ambrose did, and the conversion of Augustine, there's the guy for whom the cathedral around me was built. And he endures my sinfulness, my work, your work, all of our works will be gone, and Ambrose will be there being weird. I walked into one monastery in the East, and eventually you decay in the cemetery the way they bury you in the Eastern tradition, and there are stacks of your bones as you go in. And then I realized, me too. And so there's a weirdness at that level where death is something that the Orthodox view as an entryway to the other world, but aren't weirded out by it. We're not freaked out by it. And yet we allow it to remain other. Like we're not like the strange adults who have gotten really into Halloween and a kind of gross Gothic skulls everywhere kind of thing. But we're also comfortable around death and the human body, so that there was Ambrose praying for me in a great cathedral. And as an Orthodox person, I went from this kind of, to, that's awesome. And so I think that's Orthodoxy works well that way. It's not the only branch of Christianity that has that effect, but lots of branches of Christianity don't do that at all. They're either purely rationalistic, or they really, really, really don't want you to think about miracles.
Yeah. I think as you were speaking, another possible draw came to me, in that I am becoming more and more convinced, the more people I'm speaking to, the more people I'm interviewing, the more I'm writing, I'm becoming more and more convinced that we are desperate to knock ourselves off the top of the cosmic pyramid. Like, we are so longing to give up our place as at the top of the food chain, to not be the biggest and most powerful thing that we know. And I think you can kind of see symptoms of that everywhere. But I think there's something about your tradition in particular that reminds us that there is a good kind of small and we are it. There's a good kind of finite and we are it. I mean, when you look at the good God, who is essentially unapproachable and undescribable, and everything we say about God is the best thing that we can say, but we can never capture God in his essence. We can say true things about God and about what God did in the person of Jesus Christ. There's a real history. Jesus really lived and died. The body that went into the tomb, came out of the tomb, transformed. All those things are true. They're true. They're true in the sense that I, as a philosopher, would want to talk about truth. But there's a transcendence that then, you're right, puts me in my place, that says, the existence of aliens is a really good example of how comfortable Orthodoxy can be with weirdness.
So we don't have a view about aliens. But I think my secular friends who want to believe in aliens, and I'm a science fiction fan, really want somebody to come and put us in our place and also make it so we don't destroy ourselves. Like give us some kind of enlightenment or some kind of hope that there's a more rational civilization. Orthodoxy, on the other hand, has a menu of explanations for what could be occurring if we had a first encounter with another race. My suspicion is, and I don't say this to be cute, but given how people behave, that if we have a first encounter, it's likely pilgrims coming to Bethlehem to see where the incarnation occurred, and they finally made it. Right around Christmas. And so that will be remarkable. But it will, again, if we met other intelligences, it would still give us a longing for the transcendent, because those other intelligence, even if they had space travel, wouldn't be sufficient to ground the love that moves the heavens and the furthest stars. It would still be inadequate. It would still be finite. I once gave a talk to a group that believes in a finite God. We don't have to get into which group it was. And the problem I felt was not even their history or some problems, some anomalies in their holy book. They were used to hearing that. The problem is that I am so flawed and began my life in such a flawed way, but I want to love my wife, Hope, transcendently. And that love is great, but it isn't infinite, but it points to this great possibility of a love that is total, that is absolute. And maybe it doesn't exist, but whenever humans have heard about it, they've longed for it. And so the mere possibility that it could exist means any intelligence that we ran into that was finite, any intelligence that we ran into that was finite would be inadequate to ground us. The horrible film Indiana Jones 4, the Crystal Skull one, well, evidently the Russian woman has never read a fairy tale, so she has to know everything. I have a little bit of sympathy for that, in that she's looking for something big enough to ground everything. And everything includes all the past and all the possibilities and all the loves that could ever be, and also that can last long enough to redeem human suffering. The human suffering that was on Titanic was awful. We've talked about Titanic. And so you need time for love to begin to heal wounds. And we need a transcendent love that has an infinite amount of time to give meaning to things that I wouldn't even dare to attach meaning to now, even though that was 1912. It's still too soon for any human apologist to try to say, well, it's okay that that happened and that suffering occurred because of a trite reason A, B, and C. But over the plenitude of time, with an infinity of love, there is hope in the human heart that such suffering can find meaning.
Well, just bringing things back to the finitude of time, because we are running out of time.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry about that.
Here as well. But back to a very more prosaic sort of aspect of this, because we've talked about, some of the reasons why we're seeing young men especially, drawn to Eastern Orthodoxy, the kind of crisis among young men that you mentioned at the beginning, John Mark, the weirdness that we've talked about that very many people are looking for, the kind of the sense of humility that Belle mentioned, that people perhaps actually don't want to be at the top of the food chain and recognize they're finite. I mean, another aspect of this, and it links, I think, to the kind of masculine identity crisis, if you like, is the vibe shift that we've been seeing in culture with the election of Donald Trump, the rise of more kind of populist and nationalistic kind of forms of government in different parts of the world. And so a lot of people have linked this move, especially young men, kind of looking for a more traditional, kind of grounded, historic, maybe form of faith that asks more of them. That it's tied into that, as we've kind of, as perhaps people are rejecting the quote unquote, more woke, progressive kind of agendas of previous governments and shifting in a more right wing direction. I mean, is there some truth in that's kind of partly where that
I think this probably is coming from? And I don't think it's bad. I think all of us come to the truth in partly noble reasons, partly defective reasons, sometimes partly bad reasons. Like we're stumbling our way towards the light. When a scientist makes a great discovery, and then we benefit from it, we don't quiz their motivations and reject the discovery because they wanted to get rich. And so they developed this wonderful product. We don't throw it aside. So I do think that there are mixed motives for people coming, but I would like to say something good. Orthodoxy says, take my Philhellenism, because I love Plato and I love Greek culture. I can't be a Greek. I wish I could be. I also love Russian culture. I wish I could be Russian, and I can't be. I'm so boringly Anglo-Saxon when they ran. If you're from West Virginia, like everyone intermarries, that if I went to a certain part of Whitechapel, if it's endured, I bet I could find a relative. And so it's very strange, and it's okay to love your folks. Now, this is a very lesser love. And it has been perverted in jillions of ways. There's no place in the church for jingoism, a great American expression for, loving your country inappropriately. But to love your folks, to love where you came from, to love your family, to love your extended family, to love my home state of West Virginia and Appalachian culture, recognizing all its flaws. And Appalachian culture certainly has entered a kind of dark period, a terrible period where we used to produce wonderful folk music, and now we're producing opioid addicts. And some of this was done to us, and some of it we've done to ourselves. But it's okay for me to be proud to be a West Virginian. It's okay for me to look with pride to that. And Orthodoxy, which can fall into kind of ethnic evils, also, though, has a strong sense of, we're going to do the service in Romanian because you're Romanian, and it's okay to be Romanian, is a strong streak inside of Orthodoxy. And I think people find it appealing. Now, I don't know what to call that politically, but I think we so reacted in the 20th century to the real evils of jingoistic nationalism, particularly in Germany and Italy, that we got to the point where when I went to school and they did, where are you from? In the United States, the point is you're from like 50 different places and we'll celebrate all of them. And when I was asked where my folks came from, all I had was Great Britain. And it actually was humiliating. Like people were, what's wrong with you? This is the most boring like map of where you're from possible. But I think inside of Orthodoxy, someone would come and say, it's okay. It's okay to be proud of the fact that your family came from Great Britain. In fact, just from England. We're not British, we're English only. And I will only tell you, in fifth grade, that was kind of in the American context, a shameful experience in the kind of schools I went to, because you should be, 15 different groups of people. And that's a glorious thing in the U.S. And so I think people find that appealing. It's okay to be proud of your heritage as long as you don't tell lies about it, and as long as your love doesn't become disproportionate.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I could go on and on and on talking about this.
Unfortunately, the great aunt that I told you about would tell you that I can go on and on and on. I can only tell you, people from the 19th and early 20th century were the bluntest people I ever met. When I gained weight, she would just come in and she would say, "You are fat." But she also asked me once if I'd ever heard of anyone talking themselves to death. And so if it's possible, I can do it.
I think I could do it too. So let's just, because honestly, I want to ask you more about mysticism. I want to ask you more about the emotional intelligence of also. Oh, there's so much. But this has been the most beautiful, beautiful conversation.
Orthodoxy is a church for true romantics who don't want to let romanticism consume them.
That's a
nice
way of putting it. Yeah, I like it. Well, thank you so much. It's been lovely. I've learned a lot over the last hour of conversation, and all the best as you continue to document this interesting renewal and revival in Orthodox circles. As you say, it's a long game in Orthodoxy, and we'll see what this brings and what the outcomes may be. But for now, thanks for being our guest and telling us about the re-enchantment that Eastern Orthodoxy is bringing in many Western circles. Thanks for being our guest today, John Mark.
Yes. And just to thank you, our wonderful listeners and viewers. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as Justin and I did. If you would like to subscribe, review, do all of those helpful things, we would be so appreciative. Also, as ever, you can be a part of making these conversations happen. All of the information you would need is at seenandunseen.com/give. But for now, I guess, reluctantly, it's time for us to say goodbye. We will see you next time.
All right. Thank you.
See you next time. Goodbye.